The grand estate of Richard Lawson was a testament to years of hard work, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of success. The evening air was filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses as an eclectic mix of high-profile guests filled the opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow on the elegantly decorated space, where silk drapes framed floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked meticulously manicured gardens. Richard stood at the center, a tall figure clad in a tailored suit, his warm smile and confident demeanor drawing the admiration of everyone around him. As he raised his glass to toast to his achievements, the guests erupted into applause. "To Richard Lawson, a visionary who has built an empire from the ground up," a voice boomed from the crowd, sending a ripple of cheers through the room. Richard's heart swelled with pride, and he felt a surge of energy from the recognition that surrounded him. Thank you," he called out, his voice steady and full of charisma. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you. Each and every one of you has played a role in this journey, and I am deeply grateful for your support." He scanned the room, locking eyes with his wife, Claire, who stood at the edge of the crowd. Her radiant smile, framed by her elegant updo, warmed his heart. She was the anchor in his life, the one who kept him grounded amidst the whirlwind of success. He gestured for her to join him, and she gracefully moved toward him, her gown flowing like water around her legs. "Richard, darling," she whispered as she approached him. "You're the star of the evening. Just look at them all." "I'm just a man who took a chance," he replied, brushing off the compliment with a modest smile. "But I couldn't have achieved any of this without you by my side." As the night wore on, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Guests mingled, sharing stories and exchanging business cards, all while indulging in exquisite hors d'oeuvres and fine wine. Richard reveled in the lavishness of it all, feeling a sense of invincibility that came from being at the top of his game. Yet beneath the surface of his confident exterior, there was a flicker of unease, a nagging thought that perhaps success was not solely measured in wealth and accolades. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the ballroom, followed by a rush of heat that swept over the crowd. Richard's heart raced as he turned towards the source of the sound. Panic ensued as guests began to scream and scatter, the air growing thick with smoke. A sense of dread washed over him as he realized the truth. There was a fire. "Claire!" he shouted, his voice barely piercing through the chaos. He scanned the room, his eyes frantically searching for her familiar figure. "Claire, where are you?" In that moment of turmoil, Richard's instincts kicked in. He pushed through the crowd, urging people to stay calm as they fled the building. "Everyone, the exits are this way," he called out, his voice steady despite the rising panic. But as he moved, the flames erupted further, swallowing the rich decor and turning the ballroom into a hellish inferno. Minutes felt like hours as Richard fought his way through the throngs of terrified guests, desperately trying to find his wife. He spotted Claire just as she was being swept away by the panicked crowd. "Claire!" he yelled, reaching out to grab her hand. "We have to get out of here." "Richard, the children!" she cried, her eyes wide with fear. For a fleeting moment, time froze. Richard's heart sank as he remembered their two children, Ethan and Lily, who were at the party with a babysitter. "Stay here," he commanded Claire, though his heart was already racing towards the direction where he had last seen the kids. He dashed through the smoke-filled hallways, calling out for Ethan and Lily. "Betsy!" he yelled, searching for the babysitter. "Betsy, where are you?" The heat intensified and the flames danced closer, licking at the walls as he pushed through the thickening smoke. He could hear the crackling of the fire, the building groaning as it succumbed to the chaos. His heart raced with every step, fear clawing at his throat as he called out again, "Ethan, Lily!" His voice was swallowed by the roar of the blaze, and despair settled in as he stumbled upon the nursery. The room was engulfed in flames, the air thick with acrid smoke. "No, no, no," he muttered, panic surging through him. "Dad!" came a small voice from behind him. Richard turned to see Ethan, his eyes wide with terror. "Dad, I can't find Lily!" "Stay close to me," Richard shouted, grabbing Ethan's hand. "We have to find her and get out of here." They rushed through the hall, the heat so intense it felt like they were walking through a furnace. Richard's mind raced as he tried to remember the layout of the house. "Lily!" he screamed, desperation clawing at his chest. Just as they reached the main staircase, Richard caught sight of Lily curled up in a corner, eyes squeezed shut against the smoke. He rushed over and scooped her into his arms, relief flooding him as he held her close. "I've got you, sweetheart, we're getting out." Together they stumbled down the stairs, Richard's heart pounding with both fear and the fierce instinct to protect his children. As they reached the front door, the flames roared behind them, threatening to consume everything in their path. With one last push, he threw open the door and burst into the night air, the cool breeze hitting his face like a splash of cold water. They fell onto the grass, gasping for breath, as the reality of what had just happened washed over them. Richard looked around, searching for Claire, panic rising once more. "Claire!" he called, his voice hoarse. She emerged from the crowd of fleeing guests, her dress singed and her hair tousled. Relief washed over him as she rushed to them, wrapping her arms around both children. "Thank God you're safe," she cried, her voice trembling. But as they stood there, watching the flames consume their home, Richard felt a wave of guilt crash over him. He had failed to protect his family. He had failed at the one thing that mattered most. The fire raged on, a furious beast that swallowed his dreams, his achievements, and everything he had built. In the aftermath, Richard stood in the cold light of dawn, surrounded by the charred remains of his once magnificent estate. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt wood, and the echoes of laughter and celebration felt like a cruel joke. His heart was heavy with grief and guilt, a weight that seemed insurmountable. As fire trucks sputtered and sirens wailed in the distance, Richard felt the world around him collapse. He had been lauded as a successful businessman, a beloved husband and father, and now he stood amidst the ashes of his former life, grappling with the harsh reality of what he had lost. The charred remains of his empire lay scattered before him, a haunting reminder of his failure to protect those he loved. "Why didn't I see it coming?" he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The blame weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he felt the tears welling up in his eyes. "I should have done more." "Richard, it's going to be okay," Claire said softly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "We're alive, and that's what matters." But Richard could hardly hear her words. All he could think of was the life they had built together, the memories now reduced to smoldering ruins. The laughter of the party, the toast he had given, all seemed like a cruel mirage now, fading away into the smoke. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of despair, wondering how they would ever rebuild what they had lost. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on the devastation, Richard knew that this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. He had lost everything, but in that loss, he felt a flicker of something deeper stirring within him, a question of who he truly was, beyond the titles and the wealth. The fire had taken his empire, but it had also ignited a spark of transformation, one that would lead him down a path he could never have imagined. The journey to rediscover himself had begun, though he had no idea where it would lead. Richard Lawson stood alone in the small, dimly lit apartment that had become his new reality. The once magnificent mansion where he had entertained the elite of society was now a haunting memory, replaced by peeling wallpaper and a persistent musty odor that clung to the air. He moved through the cramped living space, a far cry from the luxurious surroundings he had once called home, and felt as though he were merely a ghost, haunting the remnants of his former life. The faint sound of traffic outside barely penetrated the walls, but Richard found little solace in the world beyond. He had traded the raucous laughter of parties for the oppressive silence of solitude. As he sank into a worn-out armchair that creaked under his weight, the memories swirled in his mind like smoke from the fire that had consumed everything he held dear. He could almost hear the echoes of his children's laughter, feel the warmth of his wife's embrace, and see the shimmering lights of the city from his terrace. Now, all he had was emptiness. "Richard," he whispered to himself, his voice cracking under the weight of despair. He ran a hand through his hair, now unkempt and showing hints of grey. "What have you become?" His phone buzzed on the cluttered table, interrupting his thoughts. He stared at the screen, half hoping it was a call from an old business associate or a friend checking in on him. Instead, it was a notification from a social media platform filled with images of lavish parties and successful ventures that now felt like a slap in the face. Richard tossed the phone aside, unable to bear the sight of the lives he no longer belonged to. Days turned into weeks, and Richard found himself slipping deeper into a pit of isolation. He stopped answering calls and ignored messages. He spent hours staring out of the window, watching the world move on without him. In his darkest moments, he questioned whether life had any meaning left for him. It was as though he had lost not only his wealth, but also the essence of who he was. One dreary afternoon, as he sat in the cafe across the street from his apartment, he caught a glimpse of a woman at the counter. She had an infectious smile, and despite the drab surroundings, her presence seemed to light up the space. Clara, he later learned, was a waitress at the cafe, working tirelessly to make ends meet. Her laughter echoed across the room, drawing Richard's attention as she interacted with customers, each exchange filled with warmth and genuine kindness. As the days passed, Richard found himself returning to the cafe more frequently, not just for the coffee but to catch sight of Clara. He admired how she moved with grace, how she could turn the mundane act of serving into something beautiful. One day, he mustered the courage to approach her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this seat taken?" Clara looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "No, not at all. Please have a seat." There was something refreshing in her demeanor, a spark that reminded Richard that joy still existed, even if he couldn't feel it himself. "I'm Richard," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Clara," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "Nice to meet you." For a moment they sat in awkward silence, Richard unsure of what to say next. He glanced around the cafe, watching other patrons engage in lively conversations, and felt the weight of his own isolation pressing down on him. "What brings you here?" Clara asked, a gentle curiosity in her voice. Richard hesitated, the truth of his situation hanging heavily on his heart. "Just, trying to find some normalcy, I guess." He forced a smile, hoping it would mask the pain behind his eyes. Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "We all have our struggles, don't we? I've had my fair share of challenges too." She paused, her gaze drifting momentarily. "Life can be tough." Richard felt a flicker of connection in her words. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Clara took a deep breath as if summoning the courage to share her story. "I lost my parents in a car accident a few years ago. It was sudden, and I was left to navigate everything on my own. I guess I'm still trying to figure it all out." Her voice wavered, but she held her head high. "I'm sorry to hear that," Richard said, sincerity lacing his tone. "I can relate to that feeling of loss. I had a family once too." He paused, the memories flooding back. His children's laughter, his wife's smile, all now turned to ash. Clara's eyes softened with understanding. "It's hard, isn't it? Sometimes it feels like the world moves on while we're stuck in place." Richard nodded, feeling an odd sense of comfort in their shared pain. "I used to think I had everything figured out. Success, wealth, a beautiful family. Then it all went up in flames." His voice cracked at the last word, and he looked away, ashamed of the tears welling in his eyes. Clara reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You're not alone, Richard. It's okay to feel lost. We all have our broken pieces. It's how we choose to rebuild that matters." Her words struck a chord within him, a subtle reminder that perhaps there was still hope. In that moment, Richard realized that Clara had become a lifeline, a flicker of possibility in his otherwise dark world. As weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Richard began to share more of his story, and Clara listened intently, offering encouragement and understanding. She brought light into his life, challenging him to confront his demons rather than allowing them to consume him. Yet despite her unwavering support, Richard still felt adrift, struggling to find a purpose beyond the confines of his apartment. One day, as they walked together after Richard had finished his coffee, Clara suggested, "Why don't you volunteer at the shelter? They could use someone with your experience." Her voice was filled with enthusiasm, and Richard could see the genuine belief in her eyes. "I don't know," he replied hesitantly. "What do I have to offer? I've lost everything." "Exactly," Clara said. "You've experienced loss and hardship. You can connect with others who are going through similar struggles. Sometimes helping others is the best way to help ourselves." Richard pondered her words, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. "I haven't done anything like that before." "Then maybe it's time to try something new," she encouraged, a smile lighting up her face. "You might be surprised at what you can do." After their conversation, Richard found himself drawn to the idea of volunteering. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. He needed to grab hold of something outside of his own sorrow, to reach out to others who were also lost. With Clara's encouragement echoing in his mind, he decided to visit the local shelter the following weekend. As he entered the shelter, the atmosphere was filled with a sense of urgency. People bustled about, preparing meals and organizing donations. Richard felt a wave of apprehension wash over him. What could he possibly offer to these people who were facing their own battles? "Hey, you must be Richard," a woman called out, breaking his thoughts. She was in her 30s, with a warm smile that radiated kindness. "I'm Sarah, the coordinator here. We're so glad you decided to come." "Thank you for having me," Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me show you around," Sarah said, guiding him through the bustling space. Richard observed families sitting together, children playing and volunteers working tirelessly. It was a world filled with challenges, but also with resilience and hope. As he helped prepare meals and serve food, Richard began to feel a shift within him. It was as if the act of giving, of being present for others, slowly chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. He listened to stories of struggle and survival, and with each interaction, he felt a sense of purpose starting to emerge from the depths of his despair. Despite the positive changes, Richard still grappled with feelings of inadequacy. He would often catch himself staring into the distance, lost in thoughts of what he had lost, what he had failed to protect. Clara's words echoed in his mind, urging him to push through the fog of grief. Yet some days, it felt like an insurmountable effort. But in the midst of his struggle, Richard found solace in the connections he was beginning to forge. He was no longer just a man defined by his past mistakes. He was becoming a part of something greater than himself. And although the journey was far from over, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope starting to illuminate his path. Richard Lawson stood in the cramped storage room of the shelter, the faint scent of aging paper and dust swirling around him as he sorted through a mountain of boxes. The dim light flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced against the walls, reminiscent of the chaos that had consumed his life months prior. He had taken to volunteering here, seeking refuge from his own spiraling thoughts, hoping to find some semblance of purpose amidst the wreckage of his past. As he rummaged through the boxes, his fingers grazed the edges of worn books and tattered clothes. Suddenly, he came across an old photo album, its leather cover cracked and faded. Curiosity piqued, he pulled it out and brushed off the dust, revealing a name inscribed on the inside flap: Clara. Richard's heart raced as he thought of Clara, the waitress he had met during one of his shifts at the shelter. She had a quiet strength that resonated with him, and her stories of survival had ignited a flicker of hope within his heart. He gently opened the album, revealing a collection of photographs that captured the essence of Clara's dreams and aspirations. Each image was a window into her life: Clara in a graduation gown beaming with pride, Clara at a community event surrounded by laughter and joy, Clara with a group of children, her warm smile radiating kindness. Richard felt a pang in his chest as he flipped through the pages, absorbing the vibrancy of her past. It was a stark contrast to the bleakness he had become accustomed to. "Wow," Richard whispered to himself, captivated by the energy in each snapshot. He turned to a picture that showed Clara standing in front of a dilapidated building, a determined expression on her face. A caption below read, "Future Community Center, coming soon." Richard's mind raced. He had witnessed so much loss and despair in his own life, but here was Clara, a beacon of hope. What would it take to turn her dreams into reality? Could he help her achieve something she had long envisioned? The thought ignited a spark within him, an idea that could potentially change the landscape of the community they both inhabited. His reverie was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Clara entered the room, her eyes widening as she caught sight of Richard with the album in his hands. "Hey, what are you doing with that?" she asked, a playful tone lacing her voice, though there was a hint of concern beneath it. "I found this in the storage," Richard replied, holding it up for her to see. "It's incredible. You've done so much, Clara." She stepped closer, her expression softening as she looked at the photos. "I was young and full of dreams," she said quietly, reflecting on the past. "Life has a way of changing those dreams, doesn't it?" Richard felt a wave of empathy wash over him. "It doesn't have to. I mean, maybe we can still do something about it. You wanted to create a community center, right?" A flicker of surprise crossed Clara's face. "You remember that?" "How could I forget? It's a brilliant idea, and I think it's time we make it happen. Together." Clara's eyes sparkled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "But Richard, it's not that simple. There are permits to secure, funding to find, and we're just two people. Two people can make a difference," he insisted, a newfound determination coursing through him. "Look at what you've accomplished already. You've inspired me to find purpose again. If we can rally the community, maybe we can gather support." Clara considered his words, her brow furrowing in thought. "You really believe that?" "I do. We've seen what happens when people come together. Look at this shelter. It's a testament to that. We have a chance to create something lasting, something that can uplift everyone." Clara smiled hesitantly, but Richard could see the glimmer of excitement beneath her doubt. "Okay, but it won't be easy. We'll face challenges, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "We'll face them together," he reassured her, feeling a sense of camaraderie blooming between them. "I've lost everything before, but I've learned that sometimes it's the struggle that brings out the best in us." As they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of Clara's dreams, Richard felt the weight of his own burdens lift slightly. He could almost visualize the community center, filled with laughter and life, a place where dreams could be reborn. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Clara dedicated their weekends to planning the project. They organized brainstorming sessions at the shelter, inviting locals to share their ideas and aspirations. The energy was electric. People began to gather, sharing stories and visions of what the community center could become. One evening, as they sat in a circle with a handful of community members, Richard felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. "I want this place to be a safe haven for everyone," Clara said, her voice steady and passionate. "A space where we can offer resources, education, and support to those in need." A man named David chimed in, "And we can host workshops to teach skills like cooking and budgeting. We could even have a garden." Richard nodded, feeling the momentum building. "Yes, a community garden would not only provide fresh produce but also bring people together. We can cultivate not just crops, but connections." As ideas bounced around the room, Richard felt a warmth spreading through him. It was a feeling he thought he had lost forever, the joy of working towards something meaningful. For the first time since the fire, he felt a sense of fulfillment that transcended material wealth. However, as the days turned into weeks, Richard couldn't shake the shadow of doubt that loomed over him. What if they failed? What if his past mistakes haunted him, preventing him from moving forward? He often found himself staring out of his apartment window, lost in thought, the city lights flickering like distant stars. One evening, after a particularly successful planning session, Richard and Clara sat on the steps outside the shelter, the cool night air wrapping around them. "Do you think we're actually going to pull this off?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara turned to him, her expression earnest. "I believe in us, Richard. I believe in this community. Change is hard, but we're already making strides. Look at how many people are willing to help. But what if something goes wrong? What if nobody cares?" Richard's heart raced as he opened up about the fears he had kept bottled inside. Clara placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You can't let fear dictate your actions. We've come too far to turn back now. Remember, we're building this not just for ourselves, but for everyone who needs it." Richard took a deep breath, absorbing her words. Clara's unwavering belief in their mission was a salve to his troubled mind. "You're right. I can't let my past overshadow the possibility of something great." As they sat there, the stars twinkling above them, Richard felt a flicker of hope ignite once more. He realized that perhaps this journey wasn't just about rebuilding a community center, but also about reconstructing his own sense of self. It was a path toward redemption, where he could rediscover the man he once was, and perhaps, even better, the man he hoped to become. And though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, he knew that together he and Clara could face whatever came their way. Richard Lawson stood at the edge of the makeshift community space, a patch of land that had been transformed from an abandoned lot into a vibrant hub filled with laughter and the promise of new beginnings. The project that had once seemed so fragile and uncertain was now blossoming under the careful nurturing of his efforts and the support of the community. However, not everyone was pleased with Richard's growing influence. As he surveyed the scene, Richard could feel the tension in the air. Local businesses had begun to murmur discontent, their owners eyeing him with suspicion and hostility. He could hear snippets of conversations as he walked past the food stalls and craft tables, the voices tinged with resentment. "Who does he think he is, coming in here and taking over?" one vendor grumbled to another, folding his arms defiantly. Richard's heart sank. He had hoped that by creating a space for people to come together, he could foster goodwill and collaboration. Instead, it seemed he had inadvertently become a target. The shadow of his past failures loomed larger now than it ever had before. "Richard," Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, warm and inviting. She approached him with a bright smile, her apron still dusted with flour from the bakery stand she had been helping at. "You should come see what we've done with the community garden." He turned to her, grateful for the distraction. Clara had become his anchor, the one person who saw beyond his past and believed in the potential of their shared vision. "I'd love to," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As they walked together, Clara began to share her excitement about the new vegetable patch they had planted. "We're going to have fresh produce for the community meals next week. Imagine how wonderful that will be for everyone," she said, her enthusiasm infectious. Richard nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "It's amazing what you've done here, Clara. I just hope it's enough." "Enough for what?" she asked, her brow furrowing in concern. "For the naysayers," Richard admitted, his voice lowering. "There are whispers, Clara. Some businesses think I'm a threat to their livelihoods. They don't understand what we're trying to build here." Clara stopped and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And what is it that we're trying to build?" "A community," he said, his voice gaining strength. "A place where people can come together, support each other, and heal. But if they keep pushing back..." He trailed off, uncertainty creeping in. "Then we push back harder. Together," Clara said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this, Richard. You've inspired so many people. Remember the joy on their faces when we completed the playground? That's what matters." Richard felt a warmth spread through him at her words, yet the doubt still gnawed at him. "It's just I can't help but feel like I'm not enough, that I'll fail them again." Clara stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're not defined by your past mistakes. You're here now and you're making a difference. Just look at how far we've come. You've given these people hope." Suddenly a figure approached them, cutting through their moment. It was Frank, the owner of the local hardware store, his expression grim. "Richard," he said, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." Richard's heart sank. "What's going on, Frank?" "It's about your project," Frank replied, crossing his arms defensively. "We've heard from some of the other businesses that they're considering taking action against you. They think you're taking away their customers." "Action? What kind of action?" Richard asked, his pulse quickening. "Legal action," Frank said bluntly. "They're claiming that you're operating without the proper permits and that you're a liability to the community." Richard felt a wave of despair wash over him. "This isn't how it's supposed to be. We're trying to help people, not harm anyone." "Doesn't matter," Frank said, shrugging. "Perception is reality. You've stirred a pot that was better left alone. You might want to consider shutting this down before it gets messy." "Shut it down," Clara exclaimed, stepping forward. "We can't let fear dictate our actions. This project is bringing people together." "People can't eat goodwill, Clara," Frank shot back, his voice rising. "You both need to be realistic. If you keep this up, you'll end up in court, and I don't think you're prepared for that." Richard stood silently, grappling with the weight of the news. The threat of legal action felt like a suffocating cloud, looming overhead, ready to crush everything he had worked so hard to build. "Thank you for the heads up, Frank," Richard finally replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But we're not backing down. This project is important to too many people." Frank shook his head, disappointment etched across his face. "I can't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked away, leaving Richard and Clara in a heavy silence. "Richard," Clara began, but he raised a hand, cutting her off. "I need a moment," he said, stepping away from her, his mind racing. He wandered to the edge of the lot, staring out at the horizon where the sun dipped low, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The vibrant energy of the community felt like it was fading, replaced by the cold grip of anxiety that had haunted him since the fire. "What do I do?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. Just then Clara appeared beside him, her presence grounding. "You fight back," she said quietly. "You don't let them take this away from you. You've come too far." "I don't want to go through this again," Richard confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I lost everything once. I can't bear the thought of failing again." "It's not the same," Clara reassured him, her tone soft yet firm. "You're not alone this time. You have people who believe in you. You have me." Richard turned to look at her, the sincerity in her eyes stirring something deep within him. "You really believe that?" "Absolutely," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've already changed lives, Richard. You can't let a handful of people intimidate you. You owe it to yourself and to everyone who's counting on you to fight." His heart swelled with gratitude, but the fear still lingered. "What if I don't know how?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Clara said, her smile returning. "We've built this community from the ground up. We can rally support, gather signatures, show them that this project is worth fighting for." Richard took a deep breath, her words igniting a flicker of determination within him. "You're right. I can't let fear win. We'll stand together." Clara nodded, her eyes sparkling with resolve. "Exactly. Let's organize a meeting, reach out to everyone involved. We'll show them that this project is more than just a space. It's a lifeline." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Clara by his side, he was ready to confront the challenges ahead. They would not be silenced. They would rise together to defend what they had built. A community united in hope and resilience. But even as they formulated their plans, an ominous feeling settled in Richard's gut, a reminder that the past had a way of catching up with him. The specter of his failures loomed large, but he was determined not to let it define him any longer. "Let's get to work," Richard said, standing tall, a newfound strength coursing through him. "We have a community to fight for." Together, they walked back towards the heart of the project, ready to face whatever came next, united in purpose and resolve. Richard sat at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper of his small apartment. The weight of the legal notice lay heavily on his mind, a reminder that his community project, the one flicker of hope in his life, was under threat. It felt as if he was standing on the precipice of a cliff, the abyss of despair yawning wide beneath him. The shadows of his past failures whispered cruelly in his ear, urging him to give up, to walk away from the fight. But just as he was about to succumb to that darkness, a soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Richard? It's Clara." Her voice echoed through the thin wood, warm and inviting. He hesitated for a moment, uncertainty gnawing at him, but then he rose to open the door. Clara stood there, her expression a mix of concern and determination, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a protective veil. "Hey," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I brought you some coffee. I thought you could use it." "Thanks," he murmured, taking the steaming cup from her hands. The aroma was comforting, Yet it did little to ease the turmoil within him. He tried to muster a smile, but it faltered as he caught the worried look in her eyes. "Richard, I know things are tough right now," Clara began, her voice steady. "But you can't give up. Look at all the lives we've touched already. This project means something to people. It means something to you." Her words washed over him, igniting a flicker of defiance in his chest. "I just don't know if I can fight this," he admitted. "I feel like every time I take a step forward, something drags me back down." Clara reached out, placing her hand over his, her touch grounding him. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together. Think of the families that count on you. They need you to keep pushing forward." Richard looked into her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of something. Hope, perhaps. "You really believe that?" "I do," Clara replied, her voice firm yet tender. "And I know how hard it is to keep going, especially after everything you've been through. But this is your chance to rewrite your story. You can't let fear dictate your future." He took a deep breath, the steam from the coffee fogging his glasses. Her unwavering faith in him stirred something deep within, a long-buried desire to reclaim his purpose. "Oh, you're right," he said finally, determination creeping back into his voice. "I can't just roll over and let them win. I have to confront the opposition." Clara smiled, a bright light in the dim room. "That's the spirit. We'll go to the town hall meeting together. You'll tell your story and the community will rally behind you. They need to hear why this project matters so much." As the day approached, Richard prepared himself for the meeting, though anxiety churned in his stomach. The community hall buzzed with quiet chatter, and the scent of coffee and cookies filled the air. He arrived early, taking a deep breath as he stood at the back, listening to the murmurs of the townspeople discussing the future of the project. "Why are we letting one person dictate what we can do?" a man's voice boomed from the front. "This project is bringing us together, and we can't let it fall apart." Richard's heart raced at the sound of support, but doubt still lingered. Clara squeezed his hand, offering silent encouragement. "Richard," a voice called out, and he turned to see the town mayor waving him over. "We'd love to hear from you. Your vision inspired so many of us." Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He approached the podium, his palms clammy against the microphone. Hi everyone," he began, his voice hesitant but growing steadier as he found his footing. "I'm Richard Lawson, and I know many of you are familiar with my journey." He glanced at Clara, who nodded encouragingly from the sidelines. "A few months ago, I lost everything in a fire: my home, my business, and most devastatingly, my family. I felt like I was drowning in despair. But then I found a purpose through this project. It's not just about rebuilding physical structures, it's about rebuilding lives." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "I've seen firsthand what it means to help others. Clara and I have witnessed people coming together, sharing their stories and healing together. This project isn't just mine, it belongs to all of us." Applause erupted from the crowd, a wave of sound washing over him. Richard took a small step back, surprised by the response. "But I also know that not everyone agrees with us. There are those who want to see this project fail. They see it as a threat to their interests." Murmurs of discontent filled the room, and Richard felt a surge of power as he continued. "But I believe that together we can make a difference. We can create a community where no one is left behind. I'm asking for your support, not just for me, but for everyone who needs this project to thrive." He finished with a passionate plea, the words spilling from his heart. "Let's show them that we're stronger together. Let's stand up for our community." The applause that followed was thunderous, resonating deep within him. Richard stepped back from the podium, breathless yet exhilarated. Clara rushed to his side, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You did it! They're with you!" As the meeting progressed, Richard felt the palpable shift in the room. People spoke up, sharing their own stories and the impact the project had on their lives. They rallied together, united in their resolve to support him. It was a moment of pure clarity. He realized that the community was not just a collection of individuals, but a tapestry woven from shared experiences and mutual support. For the first time since the fire, Richard felt a flicker of hope igniting within him, a warmth that spread through his veins. But just as he was about to revel in the victory, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to reality. He fished it out, glancing at the screen, and his heart sank. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, but the words were clear. "We need to talk. Your family's past is not what you think." The room around him faded as Richard's mind raced, the implications swirling like fog in his thoughts. What could this mean? What had he yet to uncover about the life he thought he knew? The sense of impending revelations loomed over him, casting a shadow on the flickers of hope he had just begun to feel. The journey was far from over, and as he stood amidst the support of his community, he realized he would have to confront not just the external opposition, but also the truths of his own past. Richard Lawson sat on the edge of his bed in the small apartment he now called home, the sun filtering through the thin curtains and casting a gentle glow on the worn wooden floor. The walls, once adorned with the lavish decor of his mansion, were now bare and devoid of life, much like the man who inhabited the space. His fingers traced the edges of an old photo album lying on the bedside table, Clara's photo album, the one that had ignited a flicker of hope within him. He had learned so much about Clara through her dreams and aspirations captured in those faded photographs. Each image told a story of resilience and tenacity, qualities he desperately needed as he faced the aftermath of the fire that had consumed not only his home, but also his identity. The memories of that night haunted him, a constant reminder of his failures. But today it was different. Today he had stumbled upon something that shook him to his core. As he flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper slipped out and landed softly on his lap. It was a letter yellowed with age, bearing his father's familiar handwriting. Richard's heart raced as he unfolded it, the words within revealing a side of his father he had never known. "Dear Richard," it began, "I know you may not understand my actions, but I have always believed in the power of community. The donations I have made to the shelter and other initiatives are my way of giving back, of ensuring that those less fortunate have a chance at a better life. I hope one day you will see the value in this work." Richard's breath hitched as he read the words. His father had been quietly supporting those in need, contributing to projects that uplifted their community. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. His father had been a champion of the very ideals Richard was now fighting for. The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him, igniting a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. With newfound motivation coursing through his veins, Richard sprang into action. He rushed to the shelter, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Clara was there, serving meals to the patrons with her usual warm smile. As he entered, she looked up and her eyes brightened. "Richard, you look like you've seen a ghost," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "No, it's better than that," he replied, his voice filled with excitement. "I found something incredible about my father. He was involved in community projects just like ours. He believed in giving back." Clara's expression shifted from surprise to joy. "That's amazing, Richard. Your father sounds like an incredible man. How do you feel about it?" "I feel inspired," he confessed. "I want to reclaim his legacy. I want to transform our project into something bigger, something that can impact the entire city. We can help so many more people." Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "What do you have in mind?" Richard paced the small room, his mind racing. "What if we create a citywide initiative? We could gather resources, partner with local businesses, and provide support for those in need, housing, job training, counseling. We could build a network of hope." Clara nodded, her excitement matching his. "Yes, let's do it. We can start by organizing a meeting with the other volunteers and local leaders. People need to see that this is more than just a project. It's a movement." As they began to strategize, Richard felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the broken man who had lost everything. He was a vessel for change, a leader who could steer his community towards a brighter future. Days turned into weeks as Richard and Clara worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They held meetings, gathered support, and reached out to businesses, sharing their mission and the impact of Richard's father's hidden legacy. The community began to rally around them, and Richard felt a warmth growing in his chest, something he thought he would never feel again. But just when things seemed to be falling into place, a shadow loomed over their efforts. One afternoon, as Richard was reviewing the plans for a community event, a familiar face appeared at the door of the shelter. His former rival, Marcus Trent, the CEO of a competing corporation. "Richard," Marcus said with a smug smile, "I hear you're making quite a name for yourself these days. It must be nice to have all that support considering how you've lost everything else." Richard's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Oh, just came to see how the little charity project is going," he said, feigning interest. "I'm sure it's a nice distraction from your past failures." Richard's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a distraction. We're building something meaningful here." Marcus chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Meaningful? Or just a way to mask the fact that you're still a washed-up businessman? You're treading on thin ice, Richard. I wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to this little initiative of yours." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you implying?" "Just a friendly warning," Marcus replied, his smile widening. "Sometimes fires don't just happen by accident. You might want to keep an eye on your little project. After all, some companies don't take kindly to competition." As Marcus turned to leave, Richard felt a knot of dread form in his stomach. The fire that had destroyed his life was still an open wound, and Marcus's words echoed ominously in his mind. What if it hadn't been an accident? What if someone had deliberately set the blaze to take him down? Determined to uncover the truth, Richard delved into the investigation of the fire, recalling every detail, every moment of that night. He spoke to fire marshals, reviewed reports, and scoured through any evidence he could find. As he pieced together the puzzle, a picture began to emerge, one that pointed towards corporate sabotage. His heart raced with the implications. The realization that his fall from grace might not have been entirely his fault ignited a fire within him, a fierce resolve to seek justice for himself and his family. "Clara," he said one evening, as they sat in the shelter discussing plans for the upcoming initiative, "I need to find out what really happened the night of the fire." "I think it was sabotage." Clara's expression turned serious. "Sabotage? Are you sure?" "I have my suspicions," Richard replied, his voice steady. "If this is true, it changes everything. I won't just fight for my project. I'll fight for the truth." "Then we'll fight together," Clara declared, her eyes fierce with determination. "You're not alone in this, Richard. We'll uncover the truth, no matter what it takes." As they shared their plans, Richard felt a sense of clarity wash over him. His journey of loss had led him to this moment, a crossroads where he could reclaim not only his father's legacy, but also his own identity. The true wealth he had been searching for was not in material possessions, but in the connections he had built and the impact he could have on others' lives. With Clara by his side, Richard was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had found a purpose greater than wealth, serving his community and fostering hope. The fire that had once consumed his life had now become a catalyst for change, and he was determined to rise from the ashes, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in the power of second chances.